Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the Deceptive Sexuality Trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In today's episode, I have another opportunity to have a conversation with a fellow DST-trained therapist, Michelle Edsall. Michelle is based in Michigan in the US, and in today's episode in particular, we're going to be talking about a paper she's been writing and developing around the topic of objectification, which is, of course, so important to the general work we do around DST and an issue that comes up over and over again. As always, if you would like to find out more information about Michelle or get in touch with her following the conversation today, I will put contact information in the show notes. So apart from that, I hope that the conversation today proves to be helpful and enlightening for you.
How about we use our the sacred breath, move into sacred space? It's something that we use in the Minwala model. I think you use it in your men's group, and I like to use it as well. And so I'll count us down to 3, 2, 1, and we'll take a deep breath in through our nose, and then hold it for 2, and then we'll just breathe out through our mouth, and then we'll be ready to use our voice as our instrument. Okay? 3, 2, 1, breathe. Hello.
Hello, it is great to have you here, Michelle, and always good to have that reminder at the start of this foundational idea when we're working with this model, moving from, as Omar would call it, moving from ordinary to extraordinary space. And really recognizing, honoring the fact that we're approaching this AVT, abuse victim trauma reality. And so there is that sense of honoring that, slowing down, considering the intention for what we're doing, why we're having these conversations, all of those kinds of things. So always good to start our discussions in that way. But really, as I said, glad that you're here. And it's always a great opportunity to have these conversations on the podcast with professional colleagues and other people working with this kind of model. And particularly today, I think our intention is to talk more about this idea of objectification, which we know something that comes up a lot when we're doing this work, but I think is also something that can be difficult to define in some ways, or is a term that can be misunderstood or misused. Some of the conversations I've had with Trish recently, we've been talking about that idea of objectification of the self, objectification of others, what that really means. And so this is, again, a great opportunity to develop that a little bit more. And I know it's something you have been putting a lot of time into, really looking at that specifically as a topic. What is objectification? How can we frame that? So I guess I'd love to start really by asking you why this was important to you, why you have indeed put so much time into looking at this as a topic.
Yeah, it's evolved over a good couple of years. And after really working in the Minwala model, encountering partners, betrayed partners, and their spouses, both sides, I kept hearing things like, he doesn't know me, he doesn't see me, I don't feel seen, I don't feel heard. And then I'd hear the rebuttals, but I'm here, or I love you, or there would be these rebuttals back and forth. And it got me thinking, because sometimes women would use language like, I feel objectified. And then it wasn't in the traditional sense. That term was, they weren't being sexualized, yet they still felt it in their body. And I started thinking, like, how is this impacting the relationship, and how do we work with the partner on healing through that, whether her partner goes through recovery or not? And then how does the person who has done the abuse, how does he get to recognize the different layers of objectification, how it shows up in the relationship? And that's a very wordy answer, but it was like my brain holds this very multi-layered idea of objectification.
So there's something about having a bigger or a broader understanding of what objectification means, because for many of us, our first thought, particularly through the lens of this work, when we hear objectification, is sexual objectification or objectifying other people in that sense. So what you're highlighting here is a much deeper, broader sense of what it is to be objectified, or to how would I put it? For someone to feel not truly seen, and that being the foundation of what it is to be objectified. And I know, again, through this work, you've tried to find some specific language, I guess, for understanding what that is. I think it would be great to break down some of that stuff. I don't know if there's a particular place you would want to start with that, or what you think is an important foundation.
I think the phrase collapsed recognition is really a term I've settled on. And yes, I came up with this idea of a model, but really it stems from that term collapsed recognition, where the recognition of somebody's humanity, their interior space, their autonomy, their agency is no longer recognized, and they are seen as something else or for something else, essentially, like in a nutshell.
So collapsed recognition, they are seen as an object, and I'm guessing I'm sort of extrapolating from that. They're seen as perhaps what you can get from them, what they can do for you, the role they fulfill, or something like that, rather than this deeper sense of what it is to recognize the humanity of a person.
Yes, like essentially the relational quality is absent. There's no curiosity about the interior of the other person, what makes them tick, what the very things that include relationship are usually absent. And sometimes those deteriorate slowly over relationships that don't have any kind of even deceptive sexuality. They just, relationships in general can happen. And then the deceptive sexuality component really highlights it differently. I'm being seen as somebody who takes care of the kids, cleans, runs errands, does laundry. I'm utilitarian in the household. And then there's this deceptive sexuality happening. I mean, it's multi-layered in there, because I no longer have the autonomy, agency of knowing full information of what's happening. I'm being told we're connected when we actually aren't. So that adds that different layer. So if there's not deceptive sexuality and I'm in a relationship where I'm seen as more utilitarian, what I can do, I'm running errands, I'm being taken for granted. And that happens sometimes in these longer term relationships, where people lose the curiosity of who the other person is and just make assumptions like, that's your role, that's what you're going to do, that's how this works. That relational component gets missed. And then my own personal history plays into that as well. If I'm unhealed from being raised in the culture of objectification, and again, it doesn't have to be sexual, it can be performance, being utilitarian, not being seen and heard, being in relationships where it feels great in the beginning, like the love bombing relationships where people feel connected, they think they're being seen, but really none of that is present, and that shows up as a relationship evolves. Very lengthy answer, I know.
But again, I think we see why, I've already said a couple of times, but it's this idea of, it's not just that it's necessarily changing the definition. I think of it like expanding the definition, or finding a deeper definition for various things that we might then call objectifying behaviors. And I think you started by saying in this work, this is something you hear from the partners you work with consistently.
And even women who are in betrayed relationships, who are just in relationships long-term that they are unhappy, they're not feeling seen, they're not feeling heard, they're feeling missed.
So having looked through the paper, the work you have been putting together, myself, I made quite a few notes, naturally. And under this idea of collapse recognition, there were a few points, the idea of attention without curiosity. So that lack of curiosity, I think we've named that. Visibility without genuine knowing. So like I see the person, I'm aware of them, but there's not maybe a deeper sense of knowing there. And the confusion that can lead to. And so it's good to then zoom in a bit more. There's a section that talks about forms of, I think, what you call relational reduction, the different ways that someone can feel reduced or objectified within the relationship. I don't know if that's something you'd like to add any thoughts on.
To me, there's like 4 kind of main areas where it's the instrumental reduction, where the person is valued primarily for usefulness or performance, which we talked about. The perceptual reduction, where attention is centered primarily on the appearance or desirability, which we touched on. And then the relational reflection, in the interior life disappears from the interaction, the curiosity about what's over here. And then the integrity violating reduction, where there's the deceptive or distortion of the relational reality even.
Relational reduction, loss of interest in the interior world of another person. And that was the bit that really jumped out to me, I think, reading through the paper. The loss of interest in the internal world of the other person. They are just someone that does this or looks this way or provides this service or can do this for me. Rather than, who is this person? A genuine curiosity. What are they thinking and feeling? What's going on for them? And then the integrity violating, obviously critically important that you've included and acknowledged that, given the work that we do, what it is to almost erode someone through the integrity abuse behaviors that we identify. I think this is something that comes up a lot for me, where for the men I work with, we often start with, I mean, rightfully and obviously, we start with harm reduction, stopping the CES behaviors, stopping the acting out. We then look at what is it to reduce the harm being caused through integrity abuse, to start telling the truth, to start following boundaries, to provide safety. So there's all these things that are about what we need to stop doing. And then there's this point of what is it to actually start building safety and health and connection in the relationship. And I think it really maps onto some of these things you've spoken about, because I guess I work with a lot of men who are stuck in that place of, well, I'm not acting out anymore, I'm not lying anymore, I'm not doing these things, but my sense is that would fit with what you said about when a partner is saying, I still feel objectified or I feel unseen.
Yeah, that's the relational piece. To me, it's, men are working really hard a lot of times in their recovery. And I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. And this curiosity piece about the other person really gets lost in there, because especially in phase 1, I know that you do, and the groups that you do, phase 1 is a lot of information, it's a lot top heavy, and the tendency can be to get really involved in how their interior system was shaped and their triadic core, and they want to share all of that. And they lose sight of there's another person over there that is more wounded than all of the things that they have going on inside, and they're lacking curiosity about her and what's going on for her and the impact to her. And even just on a daily basis of like, hey, I see you. How are you? I know you like X, Y, and Z. Like, that seems to be missing.
So a central idea in this work, in what you're developing, collapsed recognition and the different forms of relational reduction that can occur. So through the lens of this model, you also introduce this idea of sacred recognition as the sort of answer to this, the opposite, if you like, or that's how I read your work. The opposite of collapsed recognition or relational reduction is sacred recognition. So maybe you can talk us through that idea in a little bit more depth.
We've actually really talked a lot about it. I've just not been bold enough to name it as what I've called it in the model as sacred recognition. It distinguishes the relational reduction, which we already went over, the instrumental perceptual relational integrity violation, but also what is it to actually be seen and heard, like that sacred recognition of the interiority of another person.
Yeah, so different things we've already named: genuine curiosity about that person, concern about that person, interest in that person. So all different levels of what it is to recognize the humanity, essentially, of that person. So I think I called one of the conversations with Trish, I think we titled it From Object to Human. That was the sort of tagline or the title of the episode. And this seems like a deeper framework for understanding that. What is it to move from seeing someone as an object to seeing someone as human? And sacred recognition is a way of naming that.
It is. And I guess I could also give some bullet points, which would be the recognition of personhood, the respect for the interiority, along with the curiosity, and then the integrity, grounded truth, and protection of autonomy and agency are really encapsulated inside that sacred recognition. Because when that is sustained, the relationship supports dignity and mutual recognition, And when that erodes, objectification begins to emerge.
Integrity violating reduction, one of those 4 forms of reduction we talked about, is so applicable, so important to this work. That idea of, again, I think it gives clinical language in a way to the dehumanization that's occurring when there is a deceptive, compartmentalized sexual reality going on. So I am dehumanizing my partner, or that collapse recognition is happening when I am choosing to take away their autonomy and take away that part of them by withholding, by making that decision for them. And so that's where opening up the basement, telling the truth, using the voice authentically, reducing the integrity abuse, lines up with the idea of sacred recognition in some sense.
Yeah, and not only telling the truth, also transparency, which is I tell you before I have to answer a certain question or before I've accumulated all the details. The transparency piece also, to me, plays into this, because the idea of sacred recognition is to restore the depth, the integrity, and the personhood within that human relationship.
It makes me think of the IAR idea that we talk about, intentionally accurate, authentic reality. So one could be accurate by just answering honestly when asked something, but for one to be authentic requires actually opening the self up, being almost preemptively honest. It's almost the dual parts of sacred recognition is being genuinely curious about the internal world of the other person, but also opening up your internal world, not hiding the reality of who you are, not hiding the basement. That's part of then empowering the person's autonomy. So this gives us a richer, fuller way, I think, of really understanding or thinking about what it is to move from objectification to humanization. One of the real important implications for this work, as I said at the start, objectification comes up a lot, and this idea of sexual objectification, people will identify that as part of the CES behaviors or part of the ongoing issue. And so it's maybe good now for us to think about the applications, or what we can actually take from this in terms of application to the work, to our understanding in this work. And one of the things you talk about in the paper, or you write about, is existing frameworks, existing ways of thinking about objectification and how this perhaps builds upon that or adjusts that. So maybe a good starting point as we transition to this topic is for you to just maybe lay out those things, again, as you put in the paper, the existing frameworks and ways of understanding it.
I have a chart in the paper that I'll reference. It's more of an either or sexology, sex therapist perspective, and then the sex addiction models, which is not the model that we use. It's a different model. And so like the view of desire, sexology views that as natural, healthy, and variable across individuality. The sex addiction model, that really becomes the objectification piece. That desire is pretty linked to objectification. And it's either compulsive, dysregulated, and they have other language around that. The element of objectification, sexology may occur playfully or consensually even in certain contexts. And then the sex addiction model may reflect that, like detachment. It's sexualized. It is body parts. It is related usually to watching pornography. And then that leads me into the pornography piece, where in sexology and sex therapists, they really evaluate that intention and relational impact. And again, consent between two people. Where the sex addiction model, that's associated with secrecy, shame, and escalation. And it's a behavior, and it becomes somewhat moral in concept, also in the sex addiction model. Then we have fantasy, and sexology views that as healthy. It's considered a normal dimension of a sexual expression. The sex addiction model can look at that as compulsive or shame-based, or an inability to regulate one's own thoughts, and that it gets in the way, and then it's another form of objectification. Also, there's the therapeutic focus, where sexology and sex therapists will tend to want to integrate the integration of desire, self-acceptance, erotic authenticity even, versus the sex addiction model is regulating behavior and really based on the interior of the sex addict and less on the outward impact to another. And then the underlying concern in the sexology world would be personal values, expression, communication, consent, where sex addiction really talks about shame, wounds, some of their own trauma, and other things. I won't go too much. It's a hot topic, and I'm willing to talk about it because there's two sides that, to me, need a bridge in the middle. It's not this and it's not this. It's a lot of in between. Even the moral orientation, sexology tends to take a non-judgmental, very sex-positive view, where sex addiction tends to come up on behavior-focused with concerns around morality, shame, behavior. The absence of behavior then equals sobriety, and recovery is termed differently in the sex addiction model than like in the Minwalla model. What do you think about that?
Yes, I mean, that gives us, we could probably spend a few hours now breaking down those points and all the nuance there. And actually, it makes me think of a conversation I had with a guest recently, and we were talking about this binary. And as you said, there's a spectrum where practitioners are going to be all over that spectrum, but you're deliberately demonstrating that binary. But the DST model, I would say, is informed by both elements, but it isn't strictly a sex addiction model, and it isn't strictly a sex positive model. And so the positive view of that is it's this bridge between the two, or it's a way of offending everybody by being misunderstood and both pieces being missed. Because we often have, whether it's clinically on a societal level, really, we often recognize an issue, and then there's a rebound, if you like, in an attempt to remedy that issue. We can then go to an opposite extreme and have blind spots that way. So if we're saying as a very general statement that some of the traditional sex addiction work, one of the fears I think from many people would be that it pathologizes what might be deemed to be normal sexual behavior, human behavior, or normal desire, if you like. And so this sex positive world, I think, importantly, in some ways reacts to that and wants to take a less pathologizing approach. However, it can then lead to massive blind spots about impacts on partners, for example, when betrayal occurs. So one of the things I talked about in this previous episode, there was a quote from a book. I deliberately don't say author or book or anything, not trying to cause controversy. But there was a quote from a very sex positive approach saying we should have compassion if the betrayed partner identifies as traumatized, so long as we do not collude with her sex negativity. Which, yeah, I mean, this is a audio recording.
Yeah.
I can see your face. Yeah. So
my jaw is on the floor right now.
Yeah. So for everyone listening, that there was a reaction there. And I mean, that's the problem. That it leads to a blind spot on the other side. A bit of a tangent there, but if we bring it back now specifically to this idea of objectification, again, whether you've got some initial thoughts, and there's all sorts of tangents we could go into here, but how this model you're developing, this idea of sacred recognition, maybe maps onto either or both or neither of those things, or why you see it as an important progression, I guess.
Because for me, this model talks more about the humanity piece instead of this either or piece. Because these other two conversations really tend to miss this deeper humanity relational piece. And for me, that is so important. I know you're a relational therapist and you have a background, I think, in the Rogerian, and I'm very relationship based as a therapist and just as a person as well. And so I just really see that piece missing on both sides, the relational humanity piece.
So an extreme version on the sex positive side would be that quote I just gave you as well, if we're thinking about how this relates to betrayal specifically. So we should have compassion so long as we do not collude with a sex negativity.
Well, and what I hear in that is as long as she doesn't complain about the impact of harm to her, which is what the Manuel model needs, is the impact of the harm to the partner. And I can just feel some fire around that statement from that book of as long as she stays quiet, it's all good. As long as you don't name your harm and let it be known that that's abuse, we're all good. And I know I'm poking the hornet's nest and I'm willing to create controversy for the bigger topic to be talked about. I'm not out here trying to create controversy. I really want to have honest conversation around this topic because I think it's so important and vital to those who are suffering through this. And it's a conversation you aren't really willing to have out loud and publicly because people are really staunched in their belief systems. And I'm asking for us just to open up the conversation, to broaden the horizons and come to some middle ground really with this model.
So we've named a bit there about the sex positive approach and how that might have some, or the potential blind spots that might occur. And I mean, what we talked about there is a particularly extreme manifestation of that the most important thing is that we're not being sex negative, not the impact on the partner, not the trauma, not the abuse victim trauma reality. The most important thing is that we're not colluding with sex negativity. If we then flip it over to the more sex addiction based approach or way of thinking about this and really try and center it back on this idea of objectification, we do recognize there, really thinking clinically now, really thinking about the treatment, when we think of a list of CES behaviors, all the things that might occur in pornography, acting out, affairs, this idea of objectification being on that kind of list of behaviors, so the idea of objectifying other human beings sexually, you named earlier, we instantly kind of go to, or particularly through the sex addiction lens, might go to looking at body parts, it's watching people as they walk past, it's sitting myself somewhere, I don't know, at the beach or something, so that I can see people and objectify them. So we're seeing that or thinking of that as a specific behavior. Where I think we can have an important discussion, and one that's very nuanced and has the potential to be maybe quite triggering, maybe quite difficult to talk about, is how that maybe interacts as well with, I guess, understanding human desire, arousal, biological responses, that kind of thing. Because again, that's what I think some of the sex positive stuff is really speaking against, almost the pathologization or the pathologizing of human sexuality, human sexual behaviors, which would be seen as normal. Whereas through the sex addiction lens, it's no, that's objectifying. It's that person. And, to the extremes that we might work with clients who had cases of, for example, wearing glasses with the wrong prescription in when people are out to make sure they don't accidentally see someone or notice them. So again, this is a very delicate, but I think very important conversation to have. And it links, I think, to your model with this more expanded vision of what objectification is. So it'd be good to, again, just get your initial reflections on that and then maybe see where we go with it.
Well, and the best way I can answer that is there is the naming of the body parts objectification. And then I think it's difficult to really name, like, what is the ideal version or what's the healed version, because this behavior has been so colluded with the objectification of bodies. So the natural tendency is to not look. I won't look at people. I won't notice. I wonder if it becomes a conversation of how do men start to relate to their desire in a healthy aspect, and what does that mean for them, and how can they have desire without it turning into objectification? Because desire is natural. It comes out. They're going to notice if somebody's attractive or not. That in and of itself, that first moment is not objectification. It's what comes after that then becomes either the sexualized objectification or relational objectification or all the other things that we've talked about. I don't know if I have fully finished fleshing that out. That to me is really still an ongoing conversation, because when I'm talking with clients about this, we're talking about, all right, that desire has come. What are you going to do with it next? Some of the conversation is, well, how do I prove that I'm not objectifying, which is an outward display, because this is such an interior thing that's happening for men. And because they have been deceptive, they have lied, for them to say, I'm not objectifying, I'm X. Their partner, what do they have to believe that with? What basis and data do they have to believe that is true, when historical data suggests that may be a lie? So I think some of the confusion comes in that there's not always a visual way of displaying I am in integrity in the way I am feeling my desire. And I think that's what happens to men, is averting attention to avoid objectifying, which is short term, is not sustainable long term. So it becomes to me helping them develop how to relate to their own desire from a healthy sexual standpoint, and then recognizing the damage done by objectifying through all of these layers, from the relationship, the sex standpoint, all the things. To me, it's both and. Can they take in the harm done through all these layers of objectification, and how do they relate? How do they relate to desire in a healthy way moving forward? Does that help answer?
that actually helps hugely because, again, going back to a conversation with Trish, we were talking about first order and second order change. So there's initial behavioral change, but then there's this idea of deeper integrated change. So someone's initial response to, okay, sexual objectification has been a problem. That's been part of my acting out pattern. My behavioral patterns has been objectifying body parts, objectifying people. First order change, or the first steps, which I think may well be necessary for many people, is very maybe strict behavioral changes around that. What is it to just not look, to not put myself in those environments, to be almost relentless in my pursuit of avoiding that, to get some initial change, maybe build some initial safety, both, internally for me, but certainly for my partner. But then thinking about what does second order change look like with that? And I think that's kind of what you're answering there. The second order change beyond the behavioral change of not looking, not being in that environment, is actually having a healthier relationship with one's sexuality, with one's desire, where seeing something that maybe would have led to objectification before is not a threat in the same way because my relationship to it is completely different. And it seems like sacred recognition would be at the heart of that.
It is, because it's recognizing the objectification on all the layers towards the other, and also holding the desires healthy and relating to it. And also, we haven't touched, and we probably don't have time today to touch on the self-objectification. Women and men each participating in objectifying self as well, which we won't go into, but that's also just like another layer. So this is such a multi-layered conversation for me.
So I think just adding a word there as well, I think it's really important to do so when we reflect on the people who are listening to this kind of podcast, this kind of episode. This is such a difficult topic with the potential for being really difficult to hear, or the potential to maybe mishear, because the danger is when we're talking about desire being normal human emotion and experience and learning to relate better to one's desire, that could be very triggering to hear for a partner for whom his expression of that has caused so much harm. It could also be something that could be taken and almost twisted through a lens of entitlement of, see, there you go, it's normal for me to look, it's normal for me to be doing all of these things. So I think it's important that we are really explicit here, and I hope that's come through, that that's not what we're claiming. Well, the long-term goal is not suppression of parts of the self. The long-term goal is healthy relationship to parts of the self, which then does lead to behavioral change, can lead to more safety. But I always think it's just important that we do recognize the potential impact on partners, even as we discuss these things.
Absolutely. Because, this model is based on women saying things like, I don't feel seen, I don't feel heard, I don't feel connected. They don't feel that energetic vibrational level. We are so attuned to the energetics. And that's how we know something may be off, but we can't put our finger on it. And this is pretty much the same thing. So if the energy isn't matching the moving towards the healthy desire aspect, then something's still off. Because we as women, we feel it first before we know what's happening. So it's both and, absolutely. The partner knows. And then she also has historical data. So in the beginning, it's rebuilding historical data, rebuilding trust. There's so much that gets involved because there's been so much harm done towards a partner.
And that's why, I guess, to your point earlier, if progress is being communicated purely through the lens of, but I'm not looking anymore, or I'm following this boundary, or I'm doing that, then on that deeper felt sense where safety really ultimately comes from, that could be totally not lining up with that.
Yeah, I think I will just echo that. And then really say that this conversation is not for anybody in the early stages of sobriety and recovery. This conversation is much further down the road for the men's side. For the women's side, it is some earlier conversation, not around what healthy sexual desire is, but around the impact of this objectification. So this conversation is for the partner, it's earlier. For him, it's later conversation, so that the entitlement doesn't latch on and they'll see, or that for her, she feels the harm of some of the conversation. It is to be pieced out in some ways. I hope that seems clear.
Yeah, for him, it's that second order change, first order behavioral change, focusing on those things. But this is what longer term integration maybe looks like. So I know we're at the end of our time now. And as with all of my guests, I always feel like we could keep talking and talking. So maybe we'll talk about having a part 2 to this, or continue this conversation, especially as you continue developing these ideas. But as always, I think it's such a powerful way of integrating, recognizing blind spots, and just trying to have that more integrated, deeper understanding. None of us have all of the answers. We're all trying to learn. So I appreciate the work that you're doing on this topic.
I appreciate you having me on and just exploring this conversation with me. It's been a privilege to talk to you today about it.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure we will speak again soon.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the Deceptive Sexuality Trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.